Hello and welcome to the series of lectures by PROMAC. Now, in continuation with the reading comprehension of the SAT, we are doing the dual passages. We have done in our previous session individual questions that pertain to the dual passage. Now, we will look at a question that deals with, apparently it appears to deal with the contents of both the passages. So let's see how to interpret the question first and what we should make out of the wording in the question. Now, we have taken the same passage as in the previous two questions that we have done for dual passage. The reason is simple, because we have already analyzed passage 1 and passage 2. The contents remain the same, or rather our interpretation of passage 1 and passage 2 remains the same. So therefore, as a recap of that, let's just take a look very briefly at what passage 1 is and what passage 2 is all about. Passage 1 we have, if you look at the first sentence, it says we have 5 senses in which we glory, senses that constitute the sensible world to us but are unrecognized and unlauded. So basically we are talking about bodily senses, and we conclude saying in normal situations they simply do not exist. That means our recognition of the senses, or rather our awareness of the senses that we actually have, is not really taken into account. We do not recognize it. Now if you see, there's a common thread that runs in the passage. Here we are talking about the 5 senses and how these 5 senses are unrecognized and unlauded. In the last sentence also we say it simply does not exist, or these senses for us, they appear to not exist at all, which goes with the content that is given here, which says it is unrecognized and unlauded. So we don't recognize the kind of senses that we have. Now if you take a look at passage 2, it says a person can know something and apply that, but also can know something and not apply that knowledge. So basically we are talking again about senses, but our sense of what is right and what is wrong. Now if you see, we are talking about knowledge, and in the last sentence we are saying wrongdoing does not seem strange in the former case, but it does in the latter, in the sense, in a way, when you know that something is wrong and you continue to do it, that is incorrect, or that is perceived as wrong. That is the sense of what is wrong. And when you do something without knowledge of making a mistake, then that is another sense of wrongdoing. Now, the question that we are looking at here appears to test us on the contents of both the passage, because we see there is passage 2 and passage 1 also. But if you look at the wording of the question here, it begins with unlike. What is the meaning of unlike? Unlike means not like. So when we say not like, obviously that is a contrast that we are looking at. What is the contrast we are looking at? Contrast between passage 2 and passage 1. Now what does passage 2 say? Passage 2 says we know something, by knowing we are doing some mistake, and without knowledge we are doing some mistake. Alright. Passage 1 is primarily concerned with. So this is like a trick question. If you want, you can be easily misled and you can start reading passage 2. But if you observe very carefully, the question is not about passage 2. The question is about passage 1. Now if you just strike off this particular phrase, unlike passage 2, and you take just this one and say passage 1 is primarily concerned with, that means we are looking at the primary purpose or the main idea of the first passage. How it establishes a contrast depends on how the answer options are framed. That a contrast is evident is manifest in the question that is given with the word unlike. Now, if you see, passage 1 is concerned with, what have we discussed here? We have said passage 1 is concerned with our senses, our 5 senses, and how we don't recognize the importance of those senses. So obviously, since the question is based on passage 1, our answer also has to revolve around senses as such. Now if you take a look at the answer options, the nature of bodily senses, here we are talking about 5 senses. So probably this could be considered as an answer, because we are talking about senses as such, and bodily senses at that, because here again we are looking at the same factor. Take a look at the next answer option. Knowledge that helps us to decide between right and wrong. Right and wrong is the content of the first passage or the second passage? Right and wrong is the content of the second passage. That is an element which is discussed in the second passage. What does the question say? It says unlike passage 2, passage 1. So basically we are supposed to come up with an answer for something that is related to passage 1. And passage 1 is not connected to what is right, what is wrong. Passage 1 is connected to senses as such. Not the sense of something. Not the sense of right and wrong, to be precise. So obviously this is kind of summarizing the second passage, so therefore we can eliminate this, because though it is relevant to the passage, it is not relevant to the question that is asked here. Take a look at C, technological innovations in science. Now coming back to passage 1, since the question is passage 1. Technological innovations, from where did the author come up with this kind of an answer? Obviously from the reference to space age that we have. Space age we all know is related to technology. So technological innovations. Now is the passage about space age? Is the passage about technology? Obviously not. This is an overgeneralization. Remember what we did for primary purpose? A primary purpose question always tests us on the contents of the passage in terms of what is the common thread running throughout the passage. Alright. So such kind of generalities we said are not acceptable. The same applies here also. Technological innovations in science, totally irrelevant, though it can be misleading. D, the importance of controlling our consciousness, which means that we can try to relate consciousness to senses and all, and we can say, oh, all these bodily senses can be related to our awareness, so therefore it should be consciousness. But that kind of in-depth analysis is not required for this passage. And consciousness is not mentioned in this particular passage at all. Remember, the question is asking us for passage 1. So passage 1, there is no mention of consciousness at all. Awareness of senses is different from consciousness of something. What do I mean by that? Consciousness of right and wrong is also possible. Consciousness of senses is also possible. So there is room for misinterpretation. Alright. So this cannot be directly related or inherently related to passage 1. Consciousness is not something that we want. Option E, the biological systems involved in emotion. Biological systems we can justify by saying, since we are talking about senses and the sensible world around us, so maybe we are talking about senses in terms of biological systems that we might have, because if we take the sense of hearing, sense of touch, sense of smell, sense of sight, all these senses if we take into account, so maybe biological systems can be justified. Yeah, okay. Maybe biological systems are justified. But where is the mention of emotion anywhere in this particular passage? There is no mention about emotion. There is no mention about feelings as such. Now, because there is no mention of emotion or feelings, if it is not mentioned in the passage, it shall not be a part of our answer. So, therefore, option A is the correct answer. Option E cannot be considered because emotions cannot be justified in passage 1 as such. So therefore you can see very clearly that if you analyze the question and you split the question according to what is being asked, then it becomes easier for you. The question is framed in such a way that it appears to incorporate both the passages, but in this particular question, that is not happening. The question is focused only on passage 1. So summary of passage 1 very briefly is we are talking about senses. Which of the answer options is talking about senses? Answer option A is talking about senses. So therefore answer option A appears to be correct. Now if we lose focus of the question and we think, okay, unlike passage 2, right, the passage or the question is asking me about passage 2, then option B is possible. Now, if I reverse the order, so if I say, unlike passage 1, passage 2 is primarily concerned with. If I reverse the order, then B is perfectly suitable. Now, do you get it? That means there will be more than one answer that pertains to both the passage there, but based on how it is formulated, we can take it, based on the question and how it is formulated, we can take that particularity into account and then decide what works for us. So here, unlike passage 1, passage 2 is primarily concerned with, so if passage 1 is talking about bodily senses like we just discovered, passage 2 is talking about knowing something as right or wrong. Because we are talking about our knowledge about what is right or wrong, we are saying knowledge that helps us to decide between right and wrong. Not that necessarily we will act on that particular knowledge. But if the question were to be reframed like this, then option B may be considered as one of the options, because then the focus is shifting from the first passage to the second passage. Contents of the second passage are dealt with in terms of consciousness of what is right and wrong. Therefore, option B would be suitable. So based on how the question is formulated, we have to decide what is the crux of the question. We cannot be flummoxed with words like unlike and say immediately start looking for differences between both the passages and then try to find an answer which is probably talking about both the passages. Very carefully, if we say this is not talking about both the passages, this is talking only about one particular passage. Alright, so dual passages are difficult if you try to summarize both the passages together and not have any distinction between whatever the contents of passage 1 is and how it can be connected to passage 2. So it is always recommended that in a dual passage, you do questions which are related to individual passages first, and then do, with some idea about what each of the passages is all about, then do a combination question. In the combination question also, this is quite possible, wherein again we are going back to an individual passage and not necessarily a summary of both the passages. So I hope you have understood how to handle a dual passage with a question that seemingly tests you on both the contents of both the passages.